Hi everyone, I'm back. This is now session 11 of Steve's Sleeve on the subject of flesh versus spirit. So please, if you haven't watched the previous sessions, make sure that you watch that first. You can subscribe. It just makes it easier to follow the different sessions as they come out. You'll be notified. And we're getting to a place of culmination here. Things are heating up. And so what I want to do is just a quick recap on what we know thus far. We know that from the previous sessions, reading from Scripture, that we're not just a physical body with a brain and emotions. We also know that our physical bodies came from our physical parents. We also know that we have a spiritual father who happens to be God. And Scripture tells us that He is the Father of all spirits and that we are His offspring. We also know that we're born into this world with a virus in our flesh called sin that enters via the Trojan horse of our natural dad's seed or sperm. We know that in addition to sin and through sin, that death has also been passed on from generation to generation, and that as a result, all humans die physically at one point in their lives, and you cannot get away from it with or without the Bible, that particular point. We know that our eternal spirit came from God and was at one point alive, but that at another certain point in our growing up, that sin that was lying dormant in our flesh was triggered into action. It was activated and revived by God's holy law, and as a result, it deceived us, the Scripture says, into sinning, whereafter we were separated from God and thus required to be born again. And it's part of the reason why Jesus said, you must be born again. You cannot be born again if you haven't already been born. So once we were alive, we died as a result of sin's operation in our lives and deceiving us. And in Romans chapter 7, verse 9, just so that I can recap and confirm, it says, once I was alive apart from the law, once I was alive, but when the commandment came, sin sprang to life and I died. And we know that the death spoken of in Romans chapter 7, verse 9 is not natural death, but spiritual. And this is exactly what Jesus said, and I repeat it again. He said, you must be born again. He was talking about the spirit realm, not the natural realm, when he said that in John chapter 3. Now, here is what is so very interesting. When sin and death entered into this world through the disobedience and rebellion of the first Adam, the first man, while death began to work immediately in destroying the flesh of mankind, the Scripture tells me that not only is sin dead without the law, Romans 7 verse 8, but also that sin was not imputed until the law came. Let me read it. Romans 7 verse 8. Apart from the law, sin is dead. Apart from the law, sin is dead. So think of it this way. If you take a dog and the dog has died, there is no way on earth that that dead dog will be able to bite you. However, if you're able to revive, if there was something that you could revive the dog with, it would then be able to get up and do what it needs to do or bite you if you're causing a problem. But it can only happen after it's been revived. And the scriptures that we've been reading on this subject are all in the actual scriptures. Sin is dead without the law. It requires the Lord to come to revive it, which is what is in the scriptures. That's why we read in Romans chapter 5 and verse 12. It says, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and death has spread to all mankind because all have sinned. Then it says in verse 13, for until the law, sin was already in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses. Moses is a type of the law. He gave the law. Even over those who had not sinned according to the likeness of the transgression of Adam. Adam received a direct command from God. Those that were alive after Adam but had already fallen through sin, didn't sin according to his likeness, and the law had not yet been given. But during that whole period, 430 years from Adam to Moses, death still reigned. People were still dying. So I want you just to press pause here for a moment, if you wouldn't mind. Just stop the video and go to Romans chapter 7 and just read that chapter yourself. Otherwise, you simply won't believe what I'm actually ministering on here, that it's actually in the Bible. You need to read it yourself because it's so important, this particular subject. Did you know that the law and the Ten Commandments give sin its power to operate? You say, show me one scripture that confirms that. And I will, but just let me tell you a couple of other things that you're probably saying. You're also saying, as Paul wrote in Romans chapter 7 and verse 13, that the Ten Commandments came from God. That scripture clearly tells us and states that the law is perfect and righteous. So the question is, how can something that is perfect and righteous give sin power? You also say that God told us that the Israelites had to obey the law and that he gave the law through Moses. Now you're saying that is the law, that it is the law that he gave and told his people to live by. That is the very thing that activates and revives sin, and in addition, which also gives sin its power. Now to me, and I don't know about you, but that sounds immensely unfair to me. He knew sin lying dead in the flesh of mankind would be made alive and then fueled by the law and given power. So why tell the people to live by the law if he knew it would not be possible? That's the question. Now this I'm going to answer shortly, but check it out in your own Bible. In 1 Corinthians verse 15, verse 56, it says, the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. Let me repeat that. The sting of death is sin. He didn't say that the sting of sin is death. He said the sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. So what gives sin its power is the law, but death stings us with sin. The scripture says that through sin, death came, but once death was around, it had a sting, like a scorpion with a sting. And that sting, the scripture tells us in the verse I've just read, is sin. And once death began to sting mankind with the sin virus, all it took thereafter was for the entrance of God's law to come, for sin to revive, because remember, without the law it's dead. But when the law came, it revived, and for sin to then also have the power to separate your and my spirit from God. That's spiritual death, separation from God. I'm going to take it one step further. There is a curse associated with the law. The law itself is perfect. The law of God is righteous, and it comes from God, who is perfect and righteous. And it is most certainly not the problem. However, when the law of God meets with sin, there is a horrific reaction. The curse of the law, which is perfect, is thus simply this. Because of the sin in our members, in our flesh, you and I cannot keep the law, no matter how hard we try. And the harder we try to keep the law, the more power is given to sin. So here comes the law, but because of sin, it's just revived. And the harder we try to keep the law and the more we try to live by the law, the more that power is given to sin. So we find ourselves continually doing the things that we shouldn't be doing. And this you have to see clearly. This is not just a doctrinal message. This subject is critical to eternity, beyond what you and I can possibly imagine. This is exactly why you and I have so many things in our lives that we regret having done. And it also is also the reason why Paul, the apostle himself, wrote in the latter part of Romans chapter 7 and verse 24 that he was extremely frustrated. And I'm going to just explain a little bit more about that in a moment because we've run out of time in this session. But in session 12, I'm going to show you why you do some of the things you do that you regret doing and why Paul was as equally frustrated with what was going on. I'll see you in session 12.